Hey everybody. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about quarantining our fish. So if you ever looked at a fish forum or talked to anybody about quarantining fish, you'll know that the rule of thumb in the hobby is that you always quarantine all fish all the time under every circumstances, no excuses. If you don't have a quarantine tank, you should make one or buy one or build one or borrow one or something. Well, in the real world that's not always the way everything always works. So tonight I want to talk about my experience with quarantining fish, and I'm not a professional. I'm not trying to say this is how it's done. I'm simply saying this is how I do it. And I've been doing it for a lot of years, maybe 5 or 6 years now, and I've had my, hits and misses with quarantining, and I generally quarantine, but not always. So the reasons we quarantine are pretty obvious. You never know what you're bringing home with a fish. It might be infected with ick, it might have internal parasites, you just never know what's going on with it. So you don't want to take the chance of bringing home a fish and putting it in your tank, and then next thing you know you've got to treat your whole tank, or you're losing animals and that sort of thing. So in my experience, with all the years that I've been keeping fish and all the hundreds and hundreds of fish that I've brought home, I've never brought home anything that I know of other than ick. Now, I've had some fish that have sort of withered and died, and they've had the shrunken belly, and especially like wild caught stuff like Otocinclus, bring them home, and a lot of times they just never do well, and over the course of a month they just die off. So I can only assume some of these have had internal parasites, but I've never had an issue where I've ever had any of these internal parasites spread to other fish, and then I've started losing other fish because of this type of thing. The only thing I've ever brought home that has actually caused me any sort of issue has been ick. Now, that's only happened 4 times, and I just had to change that from 3 to 4 a couple of weeks ago when I brought home some fish from a fish store I don't normally shop at because I don't like the quality of their fish there, and I brought home some fish, and those went into a quarantine tank, and they turned out to have ick. So everything was fine. There was no harm done to any of my other tanks, and in reality, as long as you pay attention, if you catch ick early enough, ick's very easy to treat. It's nothing more than a nuisance, so I don't even worry about it. If I see a fish that I like, if it happens to have ick, I'll still bring it home. That's not a deal breaker for me to see a fish that's got a little bit of ick on it, but it will certainly go into a quarantine tank. Now, the main reason for that is it's easier to monitor and it's less expensive to treat. I'd much rather treat a single fish in a 10-gallon tank than treat a 55-gallon tank that now requires 5 times the amount of medicine. So there are obvious reasons for wanting to quarantine fish, but I can't always do it. Right now I've got 2 quarantine tanks up and running, and I've been on a little bit of a buying spree lately, and both my quarantine tanks are pretty full of fish. Neons were on sale for $1 a piece, so I've got about 40 neons, plus I've got some various other stuff in my quarantine tanks right now, and they're only 10-gallon tanks. So when I brought home the gouramis recently that I put in my gourami tank here over my shoulder, I didn't quarantine them, but I bought them from a store that I trust. It's a good quality store. I've never had issues with their fish. In fact, one of the tanks, and they have isolated tanks, so there's no chance of one, transferring into the other. One of their tanks, some of the fish in there were a little, their fins were clamped and they didn't look 100%. And right there, they said, nope, I'm not going to sell you any fish out of this. And they got their little marker out and they wrote right on there, don't sell fish out of this tank. And they were on it. That's a good store. I trust that store. They told me that the gouramis, now I'll grant you, I did get the wrong gouramis. I was supposed to get pearl gouramis, but they gave me honey gouramis. But it was out of the same tank and it was the same fish. They'd been in there for long enough that they weren't showing any signs of ick. They were eating, they were feeding well. I didn't have too much concern. I also brought home some bumblebee gobies out of the very same tank, and they went into my brackish tank over here. And that's something that in and of itself could act as a deterrent for anything, especially ick. Couldn't survive in the levels of salinity that's in my brackish tank, and if it had any sort of external parasites or gill flukes in the fresh water going into the brackish water, that would have killed them and taken care of them. So my concerns again are very reduced under those circumstances. The other circumstances I might consider are, what are the consequences of if there is a problem? If I'm putting something into my T-bar tank here, I've got some fish in there that I really don't want to lose. I don't even want to take the chance on infecting them with ick. So before I would put fish straight into that, it would either have to be fish I was very confident in, or it would have to be fish that have been through quarantine. If I'd like my office tank right now, it's got some guppies, it's got some neons, it doesn't have any fish in there that have any real sentimental value, it doesn't have any fish that have any real dollar value, and that may sound harsh, but that's just the reality. If I was in a jam, I wouldn't be so concerned about putting fish directly in that tank, because if something were to happen, what are my losses? You know, it's some neons and some guppies. If something were to go wrong in this tank, it's a lot different. My losses are a lot more severe, so I'm going to think about this tank differently than I would think about that tank. I think about where the fish come from. You know, as I said, the fish that I put in my quarantine tank over here recently turned out to be covered with ick. A couple days after I brought them home, they looked fine when I brought them home, and within 2 or 3 days they looked like somebody had sprinkled them with salt or powdered sugar or something. They were just dusted white with ick, and then they died 2 days later. And now, of course, the other fish that were in the quarantine tank are now being treated for ick because the whole tank had a breakout. So I know that that store is questionable. I've had plenty of issues with fish there before. I've walked away a lot of times because the fish in their tanks don't always look so good. That's a store that any fish I ever buy from that store is going to either go into a quarantine tank, or it's going to go into one of those low concern type tanks. You know, the fish that I put in my gourami tank here did go straight in without quarantine, but they came from a very different source, a very different fish store. I knew that they had been in. They didn't come in this week's shipment. They had been in the tank for several weeks. I knew that they'd been feeding well. They were showing no signs of illness or unusual behavior. So again, every situation is different. Ideally, yes, we should always quarantine our fish. But a lot of people realistically don't want to have a quarantine tank up and running. That's always a common complaint, and then you immediately get people saying, oh, well, you can set one up easy enough. And that's fine to say if you're very familiar with fish keeping and you're very familiar with the nitrogen cycle, and you've either had the forethought to have extra biofiltration material handy, or you know enough to keep the fish alive while you're cycling the tank in because you've just started up a fresh quarantine tank. Not everybody is like me that has lots of fish tanks and is always buying fish. A lot of people just have a tank or two, and they occasionally buy a new fish that they think is pretty or caught their eye, or maybe, you know, they did have an issue where a bunch of fish died off and they want to put a few more skirt tetras in there or something like that. And it's not always practical for everybody to always have fish tanks up and running and quarantine tanks constantly going. So just weigh your options out. Are you putting fish into a tank that's got really valuable fish or sentimentally valuable fish? Are you putting it in there that's a very large tank that you're now going to have to treat with gobs and gobs of medication if you have an issue? Or, you know, is it a fish tank that you've got a few guppies in and it's a 10-gallon tank anyway? That's practically a quarantine tank in and of itself, depending on how you feel about the guppies that are in there and what your chances are. So keep in mind, I also have said that in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fish I've brought home over the years, 4 times I've only, you know, so you're also dealing with some low odds depending on your sources, depending on how well you pick out your fish. If you look at them first and see whether they're infected or whatever, that's always something to consider before you know, bring a fish home and put it right into quarantine. So my battery light is starting to flash, so before you drop away and I'm gone, I want to just go ahead and wrap that up and just finish it up by saying that every situation is different. Always think about your situation and whether or not that's practical for you, what the risks are, and then what the consequences are of if you do have a problem. But yes, ideally we'd all like to have a quarantine tank set up, and we'd all like to always put all of our fish in quarantine for 6 weeks and make sure they're all wonderfully healthy before they go into our main tanks. But that's not always how it works in the real world. So that's my 2 cents. Please leave your comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget that this one here is my T-bar tank, and this one over here is my gourami tank. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you real soon in the next one.